Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney, CEO of LPB.
And I'm Robert Travis Scott, President of the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana. Incentives, exclusions, deductions, or credits, call them what you want. Louisiana's tax exemptions have been present in the state's tax code since as early as 1912. Used to accomplish policy goals or just curry favor with constituents, their existence is rarely questioned or thoroughly investigated.
But after several years of consecutive budget shortfalls, reductions, and mid-year cuts, a small group of state legislators have begun an examination of each and every one, from tax breaks for the purchase of Mardi Gras throws or racehorses to incentives for natural gas exploration and television shows. All will be getting the once-over, then a thumbs up or down recommendation. As this legislative commission begins its 8-month task, Louisiana Public Square also explores the state's tax exemptions. What is their return on investment? How are they tracked? And are they truly a tax break or a sign of a tax broken? A contentious budget battle this legislative session has lawmakers aligning to avoid future fiscal crises. A large contingency of Republicans opposed to the state's use of one-time money to balance the budget has vowed to overhaul the budgeting process. The governor has promised to make tax reform his legislative priority in 2013. And more than a dozen legislators have banded together to explore the state's revenue stream.
I don't think it's any surprise with all the budget cuts that we've had to make, over the last few years. It was logical that at some point folks were going to say, hey, let's see what we're giving away. And do we need to continue to do that?
Representative Joel Robideaux is chairman of the 14-member Revenue Study Commission. The commission will be examining each of the tax exemptions that the state offers and recommending how to best measure their performance as well as which ones should go.
Over the past decade, tax exemptions have increased about 167%. Big reason of that is there are tax exemptions that have been on the books for decades, and legislators don't typically review those on a regular basis.
Tim Mathis is a policy analyst for the Louisiana Budget Project. The group monitors and reports on state government spending and how it affects Louisiana's families.
There are 468 tax exemptions in place on the books right now. That results in a lot of revenue loss for the states that could go to education and health care.
According to the Louisiana Department of Revenue, the total taxes collected in 2011 amounted to more than $6.8 billion. For the same time frame, statutory granted tax exemptions exceeded $4.8 billion. If federal and constitutionally created exemptions are included, the total amount of tax breaks exceeds $6.9 billion. Individuals can choose from 78 personal income tax exemptions. There are 191 exclusions to the state's sales tax. And depending on the industry you're in, there are over 120 corporate tax breaks available.
Last year, Louisiana only collected 12 cents of every dollar in corporate income taxes, and that's because of tax breaks that we give to many big businesses in Louisiana.
Mathis is critical of the film tax credit administered by Louisiana Economic Development, or LED. The cost of the credit has increased 129% over the last 4 years, making it the state's sixth most costly corporate handout.
Louisiana's film tax credit program represents one of the most lucrative subsidies that we offer to any industry in the state. Imagine if the government pays for 1/3 of all your spending as a business. That's resulted in $231 million in revenue loss last year alone.
The Louisiana Budget Project claims the credit generates just 14 cents of taxes for every dollar spent. It recommends capping or reducing the credit amount. The group also suggests a thorough revamp of LED's Enterprise Zone program, designed to encourage investment in underserved economic areas.
we're one of the only states among our neighbors that allow retailers, big box retailers like Walmart, Walgreens, Target, to qualify for these subsidies. And a lot of the jobs that they create are characterized by substitution effects. They're not actually new jobs, they're just moving from one place to another in this state.
I think it's important to have these exemptions and incentives to maintain our competitiveness.
Erin Monroe Wesley is the legislative chair for the Louisiana Industrial Development Executive Association, or LIDEA. The nonprofit group's mission is to spur economic growth throughout the state.
When we look at other states in the South, looking at other states across the nation, we know that these other states are offering these same types of packages when enticing companies to locate to their state. And so we want to ensure that Louisiana is competitive when we attract new companies to come to our area.
Wesley notes that LED incentives make up just 5% of the total amount of exemptions offered by the state. And unlike other tax breaks, the ones LED manages are constantly tracked.
With most of the LED incentives, these are created by the state legislature. They have statutory criteria, and LED is required to report on an annual basis the benefit and return on investment of that program. And so we know that the accountability is in place.
An April 2012 report by the Pew Center on the States confirmed this by highlighting LED and placing Louisiana among the 13 states leading the way for scope and quality of evaluation of its incentives. Legislation that would have required all state agencies to track the performance of the exemptions they administer was vetoed by Governor Jindal this session as being too burdensome. But it's that lack of concrete data that has groups like the Public Affairs Research Council concerned. In a letter to the Revenue Commission, it cites the unknown financial impact of $866 million granted in sales tax exemption and encourages a better tracking process. In addition to a more thorough monitoring of exemptions, Mathis offers his own recommendations for the Commission.
Legislators need to ensure that tax exemptions are broad-based, that they're benefiting everyone, not just one or two companies with specific interests. We need to make sure that they're transparent, that they're carried out in an accountable way. We need to make sure that it provides a good return on investment. We know a lot of exemptions don't provide a good return on investment, and we need to eliminate those or cap those. Tax exemptions require a simple majority to pass, but a 2/3 majority to reduce or repeal. With that high bar, it's very difficult to get tax exemptions under control.
Joining us in our studio to discuss Louisiana tax exemptions are Baton Rouge area residents, some of whom were recruited and surveyed for us by LSU's Public Policy Research Lab. We're also joined by a member of the Legislative Youth Advisory Council. Well, welcome to everyone. Well, let's review some of the responses to the survey. When asked their opinion on providing tax breaks to companies, 62% of respondents think they are very important to the economy. 25% feel they are somewhat important, 9% rate them as slightly important, with just 2% feeling that tax breaks to business are not at all important to the economy. When asked their support for the state's film tax credits, even if the incentives are not paying for themselves, 45% of those surveyed would keep the tax credit as it is. 43% support reducing the amount of the credit, and 12% would favor its elimination, despite attracting movie makers to the state. And in terms of the performance of all tax exemptions, a slight majority of those responding, 44%, would support legislation requiring agencies to track the return of investment of the tax credits they administer. A slightly smaller percentage of those surveyed, 40%, oppose this idea since it duplicates some of the work done already by the Legislative Fiscal Office. 15% were unsure. Well, let's start from there, and I want to show you the big book that comes out every year from the Department of Revenue. This is the collection of tax exemptions and so on and credits. It's over 400 pages long, and you can see it just has lots and lots of charts and numbers. My question to you is this book too big or is it too small? How about you, Tommy? What do you think?
Well, it looks quite large, but apparently somebody thought it was the right size at the time when they printed it. Maybe not the general public, but someone.
Is there too much in it? I guess that's what I'm saying. Are there too many exemptions in it?
Well, I haven't really had a chance to evaluate it, but it looks like there's a lot in it.
Well, let's talk about some of those incentives that we find in here. What is it that you would be willing to give up as far as some of the tax breaks that are out there? For example, are you willing to give up your tax break on sales tax on doubloons and Mardi Gras? How about the tax break you get on groceries, food you take home? You get a state sales tax exemption on that. How about you, Alma?
Well, I would prefer to see taxes that don't impact the consumer as much, because the consumers are usually the ones who get hit the hardest and who have the least in terms of disposable resources.
How about some of you others? Anything you'd be willing to give up, Kathy?
Well, from the information you gave us, Louisiana has the highest sales tax in the nation, which is pretty astounding considering our poverty rate, and the sales tax is a regressive tax. So, the whole tax base needs to be changed somewhat. We may look at property taxes as opposed to increasing sales taxes, because in fact, those who have the least are paying more taxes via sales tax.
On your income taxes, how many of you are aware of any types of exemptions or exclusions or deductions that you have on your state income taxes? Anybody? Yes, Felix?
Retired people do not pay taxes, income tax. If both on the federal and on the state pensions. And maybe there is some money to be had there.
So exemptions on retired people's income, that's what you're talking about. And do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's a good thing, but if there is an exemption in tax, then the state must find a way of recouping that money someplace else. What are the alternatives?
Ellie, I believe you are an artist, are you not?
I am. And the state government continues to cut funding to the arts. And for me, that's a hard pill to swallow, because it's something I'm interested in, and I don't like to see money taken away from programs that can benefit the arts. I used to be a teacher. And
but do not many of the arts also get tax breaks in some way? Like
it depends. There are, for instance, tax-free areas to sell your art, tax-free districts. But unless you sell things to a gallery that's in one of those tax-free districts, you don't get the benefit of that tax. So it's sort of selective, I guess.
Is tax-free art shopping in those special cultural zones, is that a good idea?
I think it's an excellent idea.
Okay. I had a feeling you might say that. Uday, what about you? Well, what's your biggest concern about these tax exemptions?
For a person my age, I think education is one of the biggest concerns. You know, I'm a senior in high school, so I'm looking at college. And if I'm seeing that tuitions are going to be raised for schools in Louisiana, why should I stay? Why should I stay if I can go out of state where they might pay me? But my case isn't the only one. There are students who might not even be able to afford college. Is that the message we want to send? Do we want our youth to have to settle with a high school diploma or a GED? I don't think that's fair.
Well, he's bringing up an issue where he's concerned about support for these government services. Do any of you have a feeling that the exemptions that we have, is the topic we're talking about tonight, is making that more difficult to provide more government services? William?
Yeah, I mean, since I've been born, they've always been cutting something. You know, if it's anything that seems like it's trying to help you, they cut in education. People barely getting by as it is now. Like you say, you know, they keep raising tuition. I mean, every time they're looking for funding, the answer is raising tuition, and that doesn't help anybody, you know.
Well, let me ask you this. I believe that you do not have to pay sales tax on your residential utility use. Would you be willing to give that up and pay that tax if it meant that you could do better for the colleges or the schools?
I'm one of the little guys, so my pockets are not that deep. So.
Judy, how about you? Where does this impact you?
Well, I guess I'm a single person and I'm the only income, And whenever I listen to all the tax breaks that are given for movies being created here, I think that can be lowered. I mean, taken to where we can get more income from the movies that come here, that would help benefit everyone. Maybe it could be going towards education. You know, I think things need to be earmarked where they need to go. I think there should be more accountability.
Matt's wanting to jump in on you here. Go ahead, Matt.
It's accountability.
Well, I think that tax incentives should be organized around businesses providing opportunities for employees to become more skillful. And I think that before we start offering a lot of tax incentives to businesses to come to the state, I think they should be qualified, that they have to spend a significant portion of their tax credits on developing education opportunities in, say, vocational methods for their potential employees or their current employees.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that idea, because business recruitment is at least a portion of the kind of exemptions and credits and whatnot we see in this book. And is it not a good state policy to offer tax incentives or tax breaks or exemptions or different kinds of credits if in fact that puts us on a level playing field with other states that are also competing for those industries? William.
You hit on the movie industry, which is, I love movies, but I also do background acting, and I also work for Home Depot, and I kind of see it balance out. They give the movie company tax cuts, but they spend a lot of money in the state. If it's on food, they come to Home Depot, build sets. I mean, the money to me seems like is working out to get them to come down here.
William, number 2 on the back row.
Yeah, I think the type of business and the type of jobs offered are the key, because if they increase incomes, then there are more revenues coming in from personal income tax, which I think is the only fair way of taxing. I think sales tax should be abolished completely. It's just an albatross on the neck of commerce. But yeah, if an industry is coming in to promote high-skilled jobs and better paying jobs, fine, exempt some corporate tax, and now that's another issue. But if it's a big box store that's going to bring just minimum wage jobs and very little tax revenue, I don't see it benefiting the region. So it's a regional, and I think it has to do with individual income, individual advancement.
Some of those types of employers might come anyway, is what you're saying.
Of course.
Maybe they don't really need it. And Gary, do you have a view of these business tax incentives?
Yes, I do. I own a small business that's participated in some of those tax incentives, the enterprise zone, and they mentioned corporate companies getting large tax breaks. They do get the lion's share of the business tax breaks. The small businesses make up most of the revenue and provide most of the employees in any state, including Louisiana, and get very few of the tax breaks. In our business, we were able to use the enterprise zone by our location, and it helped our business. And it can be eliminated, but it was useful to us, and I think it was useful for the state to give it to us.
What difference did it make to you? What were you able to do or not do as a result?
Well, it made starting the business up and running it a lot easier in the beginning. Of course, it was an exemption on sales tax, both for the city and for the state sales tax, and there was incentives for hiring employees and incentives for training employees. And I think that was useful. When you have self-employed people, they pay an ordinary income tax rate most of the time how they're filed. On the corporations, they can pay a higher rate, and I'm not familiar exactly what the rate is for Louisiana, but the thing is they get a lot of large tax breaks, and that probably should be looked at in your book that you were holding up earlier, is the volume and the amount of those.
Yeah, and I believe the corporate rate is, I think it's 8% for everything over $250,000.
That's really low compared to what self-employeds pay.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. I appreciate that. And that's all the time we have for this portion of our show. And when we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further explore Louisiana's tax exemptions. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're discussing the state's tax exemptions. Joining us now is our panel of experts. State Representative Joel Robideaux is a Republican from Lafayette, a graduate of LSU with a master's in finance. Robideaux is the chairman of the Revenue Study Commission examining the state's 468 tax exemptions. Jan Moller is the director of the Louisiana Budget Project. Mr. Moller is an award-winning journalist, formerly with the New Orleans Times-Picayune's State Capitol Bureau. Stephen Moret is secretary of Louisiana Economic Development, a position he has held since his appointment by Governor Jindal in 2008. Site Selection magazine recently ranked his department the best economic development agency in the country. Jason Decuir serves as Chief of Staff and Assistant Secretary for Legal Affairs with the Louisiana Department of Revenue. An attorney, Mr. Decuir also holds a master's in tax law from Georgetown University. Well, before we go to our audience questions, I'd like to ask all of you an overall question. Now, we have this big review going on by the Representative Robideaux's commission. What do you think is the best possible outcome from all of this exercise and all of this review of all these tax exemptions? What's the best thing that could come out of this? Representative Robideaux, let's start with you.
I think the best thing that could come out of it, as a term-limited legislator, I know that I've got my 3-year window to try to fix things in the state going forward. If we can make some policy changes to both the existing exemption budget that exists, but to me, more importantly, going forward, if we say, look, there's going to be exemptions that are going to occur, into the future, and when we do that, we need to set sunsets. We need to revisit the issue. We need to require that we've got good, transparent data so that the legislature can actually analyze and then reevaluate it a few years later. If we can accomplish those types of policy changes in the way that exemptions are even given in the first place, I think the commission will have gone a long ways in fixing what currently exists as a problem.
So there would be value just in understanding how these exemptions are working and what they're worth and what their value is and so on. But do you think the commission will go any further than that and actually maybe eliminate or change some of these exemptions?
Well, whether the commission will do it or whether the legislative body will do it, it still remains to be seen. I think the commission is going to gather the data, present the data to the body, and then the legislatures themselves will decide which ones they think they want to target that need to be debated and screened for possible modifications, exclusions, or
All right.
It just depends what the body decides.
All right, Mr. Moller, same question.
Well, we are first of all thrilled that the legislature is having this long overdue discussion about a part of the budget that's really been hidden from public view for a long time. Every spring you have a lot of scrutiny on the regular state operating budget. You have 3 months of hearing. Everything is very public. But once a tax exemption gets on the books, it seems it stays there and people forget about it. And we think that's one reason why these exemptions have started growing out of control. The state general fund has been fairly flat over the past decades, but the state tax exemption budget has grown by 167%. And we think that just having sunshine on that is going to be a good disinfectant, so to speak. And if you take, and we hope that this is not the only time that this happens, that this is the start of a regular periodic review of these tax breaks so that we do get some sunshine on this on a regular basis, not just a one-time and done situation. The second thing we hope comes out of this, frankly, is if the legislature finds some of these tax breaks to be ineffective, not doing the job, and decide to eliminate or cap them, then we hope that the money that the state gains from this is reinvested in some of the things that we've lost over the past 4 years through 4 years of budget cuts. We hope that if they decide that a tax break is ineffective, that they don't just take those savings and give somebody else a tax break, that we actually start reversing some of the cuts to higher education, health care, and some of the things that we've lost over the last 4 years.
Now, Secretary Moret, you might tell us what you think good could come out of this, but you might also reflect about what bad could come out of this.
Well, actually, Robert, overall, I think this is a great opportunity for our state to position us for a brighter economic future. The opportunity is about not just looking at the tax exemptions, but really looking at the whole tax structure in a comprehensive way. I believe that with the support of the legislature and the leadership of the governor, that we can end up with a tax structure that is more competitive for economic development, a tax structure that is fairer, that is flatter, that is simpler than the system that we currently have today, which will help us attract new people to Louisiana, keep the folks we have here today, and also help us to create jobs in our state as well.
Can you tell us something that you think is unfair in the tax code?
Well,
right
I
now?
think a good tax system is a tax system that is relatively straightforward and easy to understand, to the extent that a tax structure could be easy to understand. Our tax system in Louisiana, I dare say, is one of the more complex tax structures in the country. We have more tax brackets than most other states. We have more exemptions than most other states. We have a more complicated system. And so you could take two taxpayers that seem alike on paper, but they can pay in some cases very different levels of taxes and so forth. I think ending up with a system through tax reform, which the governor said is going to be his #1 priority for the next session, that's simpler and fair and with flatter, simpler rates, would put us in a better position to pursue economic development for the future of Louisiana.
Great, thanks. And Mr. Decuir, you are the state's information bank. As in the Department of Revenue, you seem to have your finger on all the facts that are going on with this. So why don't you tell us what you think could come out of this?
Well, I don't know about Robert. I don't know about all the facts, but we try.
Enough of the facts.
But from the Department of Revenue perspective, as you hold up the big 400-page book, I think one of the important things that we get to do, as you mentioned with the Revenue Study Commission, it's comprised of members from Ways and Means, from Rev and Fisc, from Senate Finance and House Appropriations. And it gives us a chance to interact with those legislators and give them a better understanding of how the tax system works. Some of the language that's used in the tax code. And as you know, we're coming up on a fiscal session, and undoubtedly there'll be hundreds of tax-related bills. And instead of in those committees trying to explain, the difference between an exemption or an exclusion or why things are charged at this rate, we're getting to do a lot of that through this study commission, and I think that will be beneficial to the legislatures, going forward. The other thing is when you go back to the tax exemption budget book, that is a book that legislators rely on and the public relies on, and I think one of the things that we can look at is there's 468 exemptions, and the Department of Revenue is tasked with a lot of functions in terms of what these 468 exemptions are doing. And to the extent that we can look at maybe making our information more efficient for people to use and have it in any way curtailed in a more meaningful way, that's what the Department of Revenue does. And since we're on the front lines, a lot of this information comes in via the tax return. And
right.
That's our more reliable source of data, but not all of it comes in there, and then you have to, figure out.
When all this is over, you'll be able to quote all 468 of them, no doubt.
Yeah.
So, well, let's go to our audience members, and we have some questions from William on the back row.
Yeah, Mr. Moore, I hear fairer and flatter in the same sentence, and to me that's an oxymoron. How can it be fairer? The progressive graduated income tax was devised to tax those who are successful, not unduly so, but to definitely keep them interested in their income and their earning entrepreneurship. But that is much fairer than a flat tax is simply shifting the burden to the poor and working class, middle class, the bulk of the taxpayers. So I find that not really, we're talking about income tax in this case. So
well, to be clear, I'm talking about the whole tax structure, not just income tax.
Oh, really?
But those are two different ideas. I mean, the fair is largely a matter of equity and simplicity, trying to reduce the level of complexity that we have today. And notice I said flatter, I didn't say flat. So I'm not saying that we wouldn't have a graduated, for example, a graduated income tax structure, but I am saying that I don't think it's healthy for Louisiana to have so many more brackets compared to other states around the country. When you look at our rankings for our tax environment in Louisiana, for example, there's something called the Tax Foundation's State Business Tax Climate Index. We rank 32nd in the country, so relatively poorly. Most people think that means we're a relatively high tax state. We're actually not. For most business types, we're actually a lower tax state than the national average. For most individuals, actually, we're a relatively low tax state. But because of the complexity, because, for example, our marginal rates go up higher than in many other states, but the effective rates that people actually pay are a lot less than that because of the huge number of exemptions that exist in our tax structure today. So the opportunity is to end up with something that generates the same amount of revenue that we generate today, but with less complexity than we have today.
And Tommy,
with
jump
lower
on.
rates.
Let's let Tommy jump in.
Mr. Moret, I'd like to add something to that or ask you. When you talk about that, are you speaking of shifting the taxes compared to the other states? I would have thought that the legislature and the administration through the years would have already adapted to that so we can be competitive in the open market. After all, that's what drives everybody's income is the open market.
So you're asking, are we already competitive? Is that what you're saying?
I know you're saying it's an adverse effect as we have it now.
I'm saying that this is a key point that I think the public and the legislature is going to learn in this process is there's a big difference in Louisiana between the perception of our tax climate and the reality of our tax climate. I'll give you an example. If you compare Louisiana and Texas, people in Louisiana often think that Texas is a low tax state compared to Louisiana, but it turns out that most Louisiana families, if they moved to Texas and bought a house of the same price they have in Louisiana, they would actually pay more taxes in Texas. You're right; they wouldn't pay a personal income tax.
They'd be shocked at
but
how
they'd
much,
pay vastly more property tax.
Property
other
tax is much higher.
On the corporate side, Texas doesn't have a corporate income tax, but they have a gross receipts tax. They have an inventory tax with no credit for that. They have much higher property taxes, and yet they get credit for being a lower tax state, when in fact, for many types of businesses, Texas is a higher tax state. So what I'm saying is if we could get to a simpler tax structure that looks more like the tax structures in the states that we often compete with, it's going to more easily convey the real competitiveness of what we already offer today.
Let's Kathy?
Yeah. For all the panel, whoever would like to answer, Mr. Moret or Representative Robideaux, I work on environmental issues in the state, but I also look at the industrial tax exemption for the large companies that come in, a Shintech or a Nucor, and they are exempt from school taxes. And I find that rather astounding that we would create this atmosphere and give all these exemptions, but that these large companies, for those 2 5-year industrial tax exemptions and with expansions, don't pay school taxes.
Well, let's start with Representative Robideaux on that, and give us the quick summary of the exemption so that.
On the industrial tax exemption, I mean, there's a variety of things that happen, but a lot of it is the taxes that are paid on your property taxes, your machinery and equipment. But again, I feel like I have to say this with regard to the schools. That's a local tax, and so that's not something that we're really going to be addressing. Even though I've met with the local folks about the effect that would have, because we have state credits, but in a lot of times the state credits are tied in with the local credits, and so and it takes legislation to pass it.
So the manufacturing plant industrial tax exemption for local property taxes, you're not really going to be trying to address that issue.
Well, no, we're addressing all of them, right. But from the local standpoint, right. We're not going to go and really address that.
Alma has a question about the sort of fundamental fairness of a lot of questions you have about these exemptions, and I wonder if you could pose that to the panel.
My main concern is how we can justify continuing especially corporate exemptions when we're cutting vital services such as education and health care and passing those costs on to the people who can least afford them.
I'm taking a wild guess that Mr. Moller would want to answer that question.
I think that's a wonderful question, and I think that's exactly the kind of thing that legislators need to be looking at. The piece said, we're exempting 88 cents of every corporate tax dollar, and that's money that we're not spending on education, on health care. And so we really look at this Revenue Study Commission as an opportunity to ultimately grow our revenue base in Louisiana. Taxes are important for businesses when they decide where to locate, but so is quality of life, so is the quality of the school system. There are a lot of factors that go into a business's decision on where to locate, and when you keep cutting your budget every year, like we have been recently, then you're cutting into that quality of life, and that affects businesses as well. So that's why we're looking for a little bit more balance to come out of this debate.
I wonder if, okay, go ahead, Alma, follow up.
In fact, as the study commission is looking at this, I think that needs to be factored into it, because you're absolutely right. If you have poor health, an unhealthy state, or poor quality of education, that's also a disincentive for business or industry to come into this state. So
Before we just, I think Brad wants to capitalize on that question too.
Oh, no, actually mine was on a slightly different
topic. Go
topic.
ahead, jump in.
I was going to ask who was most knowledgeable to speak about the severance tax policy and structure and exemptions of Louisiana versus comparable states like Texas, which also has a lot of offshore oil and gas industry.
Why don't we begin by letting Mr. Decuir talk just a little bit, just give you kind of an overview. What are the big players in our tax revenue and in our tax exemptions?
Yeah, and I think to start off, so that personal income tax yields the most in terms of collections and sales. And then you bring up severance. A lot of people then think, well, the next bucket, you have kind of this three-legged stool of personal, sales, and income. But actually, severance brings in about 11% of the revenue to the general fund. And so that's sort of the lay of the land and where severance factors in too. But of course, considering Louisiana and being a very rich oil and gas state, severance is a big part of what we do here in Louisiana. And of course, there are some exemptions that are related to the severance tax.
I wonder if you could give us an example of. There are a lot of energy exemptions that come into play. I mean, what are some examples of some of those?
Yeah, well, I think you touched on some of them earlier. I mean, you have some exemptions for non-residential utilities or exemptions, and then you have some oil and gas, well depletion exemptions, and horizontal well drilling or some other exemptions that are related to severance. But again, a lot of those are used to incentivize the oil and gas production that we have here in the state, which we all know is a big function of the revenue for Louisiana.
Matt, you want to jump in?
Well, I want to jump in on another subject, and that would be the criteria that economic development is based on is bringing companies into our state to improve our situation. And I wanted to know how much of the entitlements that we're basically giving these corporations is tied to economic investment in education. Do we give them incentives on how many people they will train, how much education they'll provide to their future employees? Is that part of the equation?
Sure. Well, first of all, I do want to clarify that the state's incentive programs for economic development are actually focused primarily on new investment and job creation, whether or not it comes from a new company out of state or an existing company that's expanding. One of the big misperceptions is that most of the money goes to these big projects that are coming in from out of state. They get most of the media coverage, but in fact, the vast majority of all the incentives that are provided to business go to existing Louisiana companies, like Gary's, for example, that are either starting or expanding in our state. They just don't always get the front page coverage that something like a Nucor or an EA might get. Going to your specific question, first of all, some of our most lucrative incentive programs, like the Quality Jobs Program, explicitly are only available to companies that pay a minimum level of wages and offer a comprehensive health care benefit. We have other incentives that are specifically focused on education and training. So, for example, one of the things we created 4.5 years ago is called the Louisiana Fast Start Program. It's not so much a tax incentive as much as it is a training and workforce development incentive, where we help companies recruit and screen employees, develop customized training for them, and deliver that training all at no cost to the companies. One of the things that we're doing more frequently currently is when we're trying to attract a company that involves a lot of knowledge-based jobs that need some kind of specialized skills in their workforce, we're actually providing incentives that go toward a local university. For example, Louisiana Tech University in North Louisiana receives an annual workforce development grant related to telecommunications for the CenturyLink corporate headquarters expansion. In New Orleans, the GE Capital Technology Center, we committed $500,000 a year to expand the software development.
Mr. Secretary, I know this is a long list because I've heard you go through it before. But Gary, why don't you pick up on this point? I mean, as a businessman who has used incentives in your business, what would you ask them to do or not do during this particular review?
Well, some of those tax incentives are useful serve useful purposes. And in our business, it was a useful purpose for the enterprise zone tax credit that we got. And
I'm glad you brought
just
that
to
up.
say that big box stores and Walmart or Target are benefiting from that is not true. I mean, it is true, but that's not the total truth. Others, if they're active and looking at the code as a businessman, can use that too. But there's not that many breaks for small businesses in Louisiana. There may be in other states, but there's not here. There's lots more breaks for the
Let's
corporate
talk
guys.
about that enterprise zone, and I wonder if Representative Robideaux and Mr. Moller, if you would both address what you think of the enterprise zone and whether it needs to be tweaked or changed.
Well, it's hard to say whether it needs to be tweaked. I mean, I think it does serve a purpose. Now, is it too expansive? I think you could certainly make that argument. The thing to keep in mind is and kind of addressing a little bit with what she said earlier, is anytime we do any kind of tweaks to any of the corporate taxes, we have to keep in mind, is this going to just be passed along to the taxpayers? If the loss of this exemption and the cost to the business is going to be passed on to the taxpayers, have we really done anything to benefit the state of Louisiana? We brought in more revenue, but it's raising taxes on individuals, not really the corporations. And so we have to look at it to see if this is something we think would occur before we start taking it away. And so I think the enterprise zone has worked really well. Does that mean it's perfect? I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
And I think every state has some form of enterprise zone. What's different about Louisiana is that ours accrue to retailers. And so you're not really creating new jobs. You're moving jobs from maybe one part of a parish to another part of the parish and giving them a tax break. And that's something that makes Louisiana fairly unique among its neighbors. So the idea would be not to get rid of enterprise zones, but to modify it in a way so that we don't give this tax break that's unique to Louisiana, that's not really creating new jobs, it's just moving jobs within a parish. I think the Secretary would agree on that. They've put out reports to that effect, and so we wouldn't say let's kill it, but let's modify it. And that goes for all these tax breaks. Is one of the key criteria needs to be, is this something that makes Louisiana competitive, that other states are doing? If it's something that everybody's doing, then maybe it should stay on the books. But if it's something that only Louisiana is doing and we can't prove that it's creating new jobs that wouldn't otherwise be here, that's probably something they should look at getting rid of.
Yeah, well, let me pose this question to punch you all just a little bit. And I might let Mr. Decuir get a pass on this one. But what is the tax exemption in that booklet that bothers you the most? Or I could say it another way. What is your most favorite exemption or your least favorite exemption? Why don't we start with you, Secretary Moret?
Well, it's hard to pick the favorite one, but I'll give you a real good example of something kind of goofy in Louisiana.
Okay.
In the United States, there's only about 10 or 12 states that charge an inventory tax. 10 or 12. We're one of those states. Now, many years ago, business wanted to get rid of that tax, but they couldn't pass a constitutional amendment, so the legislature phased in a tax credit to offset the entire amount. So every business, at the end of the year, they pay an inventory tax, they go through the calculations, they pay the tax.
And the
to
tax
the local
goes where?
government, to the local government.
Right.
And then a few months later, the state sends them a check back or refund back on their corporate income tax for the exact same amount. So they're going through this whole process that just so ultimately the state can fund.
And let me guess, in the state rankings, we count as having an inventory tax.
The last few years, we've gotten an F for inventory tax, even though the state rebates literally 100% of it. So I know the local governments need the revenue.
So
I'm not suggesting to get rid of that. But one potential opportunity is to take the middleman out, not make the businesses go through all the hassle of calculating the inventory tax, and just have the state transfer the same amount of money directly to the local governments.
Okay, very good. Mr. Moller.
Well, one that we've been outspoken on, and this is no surprise, is the film tax credit program, which I think is almost mislabeled because it really has very little to do with the taxes that any film producer pays. It really functions as a subsidy, direct subsidy to Hollywood filmmakers, and we have the most generous program in the country.
How much is it? What is it?
$231 million is what we paid last year to have the film industry in Louisiana.
What is it, 30%?
30%. Essentially, we pay them 30 cents of every dollar that they spend in Louisiana.
Okay.
4 years ago, that was $92 million. Last year, it was $231 million. And it's become kind of an open-ended entitlement, and we don't know year to year what it's going to cost.
But there's so many movies and TV shows being made in Louisiana. I mean, is that not the measure of success?
It's like the old saw. They're losing money on every sale, but they're making it up on volume. So the more films that come, the more money we're losing on this program. So that would be one that I would target for maybe not getting rid of altogether, but certainly capping and giving the state some predictability on what it's going to cost year to year. There are some that we think are very worthwhile and need to stay on the books. The earned income tax credit, the state earned income tax credit, is a tax credit that goes to the working poor. It rewards people who work hard, play by the rules, but maybe don't make enough money. And so that's something that was passed in 2007. And it needs to stay on the books, and we certainly hope that it gets protected.
Good. And Representative Robideaux, I really want to hear how you're going to answer this question. And everyone on your committee is leaning forward wondering how you're going to answer this question.
Well, and keep in mind that I'm a CPA is my real job. So I'm fairly familiar with a lot of the taxes. And, you know...
We've got the Dodge meter on, by the way.
Yeah. And, you know... To say, I really am hesitant to say which one I think we need to get rid of, because I don't want to try to sway the committee and the debate in any particular way. I mean, I have, my personal feelings.
I thought that was your job.
And no. It's just to organize and to run a very smooth meeting. But, during the process, I'll ask the questions and make sure that I think the information's out there that the committee and the legislative body needs to know about all of these different credits. But again, I think most of them were well intended when they were enacted, but I'm not so sure that they are all going to continue to exist going forward.
All right, Mr. Decuir, I am going to still let you answer that question too, even though you're supposed to be just the information guy.
And I'll continue to give
all
information.
Right.
But, I think, Representative Robideaux hit on an important point that needs to be highlighted. And I think somebody was asking a question about the school tax. And one of the misconceptions as we use this as an opportunity, to educate folks is with sales tax. A lot of people don't realize Louisiana ranks almost dead last in sales tax, and they don't know why. But you probably know why. When you go out to buy something, there's a local sales tax, and then there's a state level sales tax. And then when you combine the two, Louisiana is one of the highest sales tax rates in the country. Although our 4% rate at the state level is one of the lowest in the country. And so when you make that combination, the other thing that people don't realize is that local governments collect the local sales tax, and state is only responsible for collecting the 4%. And that's what I think Representative Robideaux was picking up on, how that debate can then sometimes get blurred because there's only so much that the legislature can do with that.
Uday, you have a question for the panel.
So we saw the book that shows these tax exemptions thick. It's thick. It's 400 plus pages. I'm willing to say that most of them don't recoup the amount that it exempts for the state. So that's revenue lost. How does one justify revenue lost and then the cutting of vital services, education, healthcare, for the future? How does one justify, especially in the legislature, how can you justify voting these in, but then taking away from society?
I believe, gentlemen, that's back to the fundamental question.
Which is why I think we're looking at them, because I think you can go through that book and you'll find a lot that you'll say, I think that is justified. I think that, the fact that we, have an earned income credit for the working poor needs to stay on the books, because, we'd be providing it to one but taking it away from those. And what we're hoping to do with the commission is to actually answer that question, to say which of these are really necessary for the continued good of the state, and which of these aren't as necessary. Now, that's where the debate's going to come in, and that's what the legislative process is. And so if it's given to businesses to attract them here and they're going to employ 500 people, well, that's going to ultimately provide a lot of income to the state, which is going to help mitigate the cuts to higher ed. And it may exist, and it may take money away from the current budget, but in the long run it's going to benefit the state because it's going to bring in additional revenue that helps to offset future cuts. And that's the balance that we're going to be trying to achieve. And but it's still a guessing game. I mean, there's no
that's
no
one of the
way
problems,
for us
isn't it? There's too much guessing in this game, and I think Mr. Decuir would probably agree with that. But Secretary,
yeah, I was just going to add. I think it's important to understand, just in terms of the facts, that the growth in the value of exemptions is actually, the last few years, is not really from new exemptions. It's actually from significant increase in utilization of exemptions that already existed 5 years ago or longer. The other thing that's a big misperception is that a lot of people think all these exemptions are going to these economic development projects. And in fact, if you look at that whole $6.8 billion, it's only 5% actually that's involved in economic development. Most of those exemptions, in fact, everybody in this room, when you go buy groceries, there's a state sales tax exemption on the purchase of food for home use. There's a sales tax exemption on the purchase of prescription drugs. There's a income tax deduction for your federal income taxes paid. So these are things that are being used by many people across
Louisiana. And to get back to this issue, though, on a lot of those exemptions you're talking about, the law requires you to keep up with what the impact is of it. And we should go and check and see if you're really doing that. I think he's saying he's doing that. But Mr. Decuir, don't we have a problem with a lot of these exemptions that don't have that type of legal mandate to follow up? How do we actually know what the impact is, and how are you able to track that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, being on the front lines and collecting the tax, and the Department of Revenue collects about 78% of the state general fund, but most of that is via the tax return. And so you get into this sort of debate as, do you keep growing and growing the tax return and putting more and more of these line items on there, such that you have all of these you get all of these accurate numbers, but again, going to more simplistic a tax structure, the goal for reform is to try to make it more simple, and then you begin to reduce some of the lines, and you don't have all of the.
Gary, I know, wants to follow up.
I want to go back to education for a minute, because that's important in the state for bringing new businesses in and for having an educated workforce. But I happen to think that Louisiana citizens, the families of Louisiana that use private school, pay a heavy tax to educate their children. And I think we just probably added to one of these exemptions or something recently to allow some people to get a credit to send their children to a school of their choice, but not for everybody in the state. And I really believe that everyone in the state that wants to use private school should have a deduction, should be able to take a deduction for that. That might blow you up on what you're doing, Representative Robideaux, with looking at reducing these tax credits or whatever, but I think that would really be fairness.
That credit does exist, and
it's a deduction.
It's one of the page. It's a deduction on your state income tax returns for anyone that pays private school tuition. You do get a deduction.
So everyone can use it?
Everyone can use it.
Yes, and that existed before all these reforms.
That's right. We passed that maybe 3-4 years ago, I think. So that does exist, and of course, the political process is what it is. In order to get that to pass, we had to also give, a new deduction for public school expenditures also, so the parents of children that go to public schools to pay for certain supplies and uniforms if they're required, they also get that same deduction.
There were a number,
but they don't have tuition. The tuition
of education
is good, so we could learn that these things are there.
Right. Brad,
how aggressively are we pursuing eliminating exemptions and reducing the tax brackets, or lowering the tax rates themselves, so that it is easier to predict, it's fairer because everybody knows what to expect, it's more transparent, and you also you simplify it. I think that's something that needs to be aggressively pursued. How aggressively are we pursuing those things?
That's what we're focused on for the next legislative session.
Yeah, I was wondering if Brad was maybe a plan for Stephen, because
I pretty much outlined the governor's
right. I think that's very important going forward. Notwithstanding the fact that we may make some of these reductions and actually see an increase in revenue, at a minimum, if we're going to clean it up and it ends up being a wash, if it's simpler and it's easier for us to go and sell the state to other entities to come here, and when Texas can say, I think, and Stephen said this before, when Texas can say we have no income tax, and we have to say, yeah, but we have this, but if you take these credits, it's the same. It's almost the same thing. It's just much easier if we would just figure out a way to simplify it, and it would certainly help with the rankings,
Every
I'm sure.
bit of effort that's put into preparing a tax form is effort that can't be used to produce wealth. It can't be used to produce something of value.
That's absolutely right.
Well, we only have just another minute to go, but let's just go quick down the line, starting with you, Representative Robideaux. Is the biggest achievement out of all this just going to be better education or real change?
Well, I'd like to say real change, but I'm going to say that if we get better education and going forward, if we get policy changes,
and that's a good thing.
Going forward,
Mr.
then
Moller?
that's a good thing.
Hopefully we get some sunshine, and hopefully we get a consensus that we need more revenue in this state.
How about you, Secretary
I think
Moret?
this is going to be an exciting moment of change for our state.
How about that? Okay. Mr. Decuir?
Yeah, and I think it'll be an opportunity to try to make less complicated returns, simplify the tax code, and I think it'll be a real opportunity to do that.
Okay, you heard it here. Tax reform can be exciting, especially if it affects you. Well, we've run out of time for our question and answer segment. We'd like to thank our panelists, Representative Robideaux, Mr. Moller, Secretary Moret, and Mr. Decuir for their insight on this month's topic. When we come back, we'll have a few closing comments. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. And while you're there, take this month's survey, view extended interview clips, and volunteer to be in our show like our audience member, Brad French, did. We also encourage you to comment on tonight's show like viewers did last month following the program about bullying in Louisiana. For example, April writes, "I have a granddaughter that was being bullied by her teacher. She was 7 years old. I went to the office and reported it, and nothing was ever done." And Jenny writes, "Unless campus management directly involves and introduces severe punishments to those who bully, it is impossible to eliminate this evil." And Trudy writes, "Thank you for airing this program. I am one person that has been inspired to make a difference, even if it's for one child's welfare." Well, thanks, Trudy, for the kind words, and everyone who commented. We loved hearing from you. Well, in 2008, voter turnout in Louisiana among 18 to 29-year-olds increased 4% from the previous presidential election, 2 percentage points higher than the national average. But how energized are younger voters about this year's presidential race? What issues matter most to this demographic? Join us next month as Louisiana Public Square explores Louisiana's Youth Vote 2012. Well, thanks for watching, and good night.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.